in this video a games journalist was bad at a video game. This isn't the only time it's happened. Many other games journalists have been bad at a video game, but something about this particular video made people angry. It was a game that was known to be difficult, and yet he was a man who was paid to talk about games that couldn't figure out a simple jump. I don't think all of that anger was fair, but it's impossible to deny that the journalist's gameplay was especially poor, even if Cuphead wasn't the sort of game he'd usually play. Now, I want to be very clear here. Takahashi wasn't reviewing the game, or even talking about it in the video. Although the video was embedded in an article describing Cuphead, that article was hardly in depth, and it didn't pretend to be. That evidently didn't matter to a lot of people. Why would he, who was so bad at this video game, be chosen to play it? Ultimately, I'm not interested in answering why he was there, or whether he should have been. That's not what's interesting here, and the answers are right there in the now edited description of said video. What I'm interested in looking at is the implicit question that this video prompted in many discussions online. Who gets to talk about games? As I've been doing a fair bit recently, I'm going to break this discussion up into smaller segments, focusing my discussion on games I'm familiar with. Here, I must admit I haven't played Cuphead, and because I haven't played it, I'm instead going to discuss another game. One I'm terrible at, but absolutely love. FTL. Part 1. FTL. When can we talk about a game? FTL is a game I've spent a lot of time with. Over 80 hours of dying again and again. Strategy games and roguelites both tend to give me trouble, and FTL, a combination of both, just destroyed me. I only just beat the final boss on easy this year, with the ship largely considered to be the easiest to do so with. And boy, it was wonderful to finally complete my mission. But have I really completed it? I mean, I only beat it with one ship, on easy. Can I really say that I've finished FTL? Is it even possible to quote-unquote finish a game that isn't really about its ending, but rather the journey to it? Ultimately, I'm asking, at what point can we fairly discuss a game? Most games have so much content it will be impossible to experience it all, let alone to do so in the week or two most publications have with a game before it's released. It's also worth mentioning here that such a rush may lead to a different experience. See Writing on Games' videos on Metal Gear Solid 5, where he initially loves the game, but later revisits it outside of the initial rush to completion to find a game far less enjoyable than he initially described it to be. It begs the question, what sort of experience offers a fair view of the game? If I've only finished FTL with the one ship, could I fairly say I have an understanding of the game as a whole? If finishing the game is the line to cross, what about games that thrive upon, or even to some extent require, multiple playthroughs? Video games aren't like other mediums, and the point at which someone can fairly talk about them should be similarly different. After one or two viewings, I think it would be fair to discuss a film. And after finishing a book or a TV series, I'd say the same. An album, meanwhile, typically takes at least 3 or 4 listens before I think I could really form a fair opinion of it. And a video game? I don't know. Maybe finishing it once is enough for FTL. Perhaps I wouldn't even need to have finished it at all to discuss it, given the time I've spent with it. The line between informed and uninformed opinions is awfully ambiguous, and changes with each game. To apply any sort of rule or formula here would be a Sisyphean task. Each game must be considered on its own, and in context of the games that came before it to establish that line. Part 2. Mass Effect 3. Does the end of a game even matter that much? I'm not going to go into spoilers here, but even people who didn't care about Mass Effect 3 have likely heard some of the complaints levelled at its ending. While I wasn't much of a fan of that ending, we are only talking about the final 20 minutes of a game that overall had some fantastic moments. While the final moments for the trilogy weren't particularly memorable, the conclusions given to each of its characters were. Without the context of having played the game, these clips are pretty meaningless. But if you have played the game, you probably remember the choice directly before this moment, or the speech during this one, or how you felt when this happened. Even if I thought the ending was the worst moment in the series, and I don't, that title goes to absolutely every moment with Kai Leng in it, I have nothing but love for the game as a whole. It had flaws, some of which were massive. It wasn't perfect, but I loved it. The ending didn't matter to me. To return to FTL, the ending is pretty garbage. These might be considered spoilers, so be warned, but after destroying the final boss, after finishing the game, you get a message of congratulations and the credits. No special cutscene, only one new ship to use in future games, and that's it. Well done, now get out. Despite there being very little to the ending, I love FTL. It doesn't even matter. Mass Effect 3 is in a similar camp to me. Its ending was too long, its tone confused, and trying to convey narrative weight through slow movement is predictably frustrating. It failed on every front to be satisfying, but I don't care. The ending didn't matter to me, and only played a very small part in how I think of the game in its entirety. When critics praised Mass Effect 3, many fans felt they shouldn't have done so after finishing the campaign. The ending was an insult to many, lazy to others, and just not up to scratch for the rest. I side with the critics here though. Despite a few genuinely terrible moments, Mass Effect 3 was pretty stunning. Why should the last 20 minutes condemn a game that took many upwards of 30 hours to complete? Obviously, I don't think it should, and when I discuss who gets to talk about games, I'm not just talking about my own opinion here. And indeed, I'm questioning whether mine should be held in any higher or lower regard than the average Steam review. Who gets to talk about games is a question I pose to myself as well as others. Part 3, TF2. What does good even mean anyway? The Cuphead incident riled up a lot of people who thought that because they were better at platformers or games in general, they would be better qualified to discuss them. How could Takahashi assess the game's difficulty if he was barely good enough to complete the tutorial? There's a bit of a problem here though. Who defines good? Where does good begin and end? In FTL, I only managed to finish it once, with one ship on easy. That's not particularly good, but there were many critics at its release that reviewed the game without having conquered that final fight. So what is good enough? I don't think completion is all that important in FTL's case, but a review of Undertale, for example, would be awfully weak without having at least finished one run. Then what about games you can't finish, like multiplayer games? When are you really qualified to discuss a multiplayer title? There's only one multiplayer title I'm really familiar with, so forgive me if you're tired of hearing about TF2 on this channel, but it does make for a particularly good example here. I'm decent at TF2. Not amazing, but I have a reasonable grasp of the mechanics and how to use them to my advantage. The thing is, my decent is not another's. I have over 2,000 hours in TF2, and more time spent playing individual classes than most casual players would have in the game as a whole. This is the only multiplayer title I play, and I'm more well acquainted with it on a mechanical level than I am with any other game, and with that experience comes a certain perspective. I play better than most casual players ever will, but I can also see how many mechanics I will never master, mechanics the casual player may not even realise are possible. This is a great example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with the least amount of knowledge won't even have the knowledge to realise how little they know, while a more knowledgeable person will realise just how far they are from actual expertise. So in this case, a player with 100 hours, based on what to them would seem a lot of time, would likely think they were much closer to the higher end of the skill curve than how close I might think myself to be. I've been around long enough to play with some truly skilled players and watch many others from the competitive scene. I know how good I'm not, while the theoretical 100-hour player doesn't know how much better people can be at TF2, nor how much further behind they are mechanically in reality. So how good is good enough to discuss a game, and who decides? Would the theoretical 100-hour player be a better representation of where good begins, given they probably sit closer to the average player than I might? On the other hand, with more knowledge of the TF2 scene, would I be the better judge? A while back, one of the larger TF2 YouTubers that hasn't yet gone to the dark side decided to review a new feature introduced into the game, a casual matchmaking system. I mention this review because Uncle Dane chose to make this video only after reaching the highest possible rank in that system. The video was about as comprehensive as it could have been, and I'm certainly not saying that's a bad thing, but it's an interesting answer to the questions I'm posing here. The same answer you might provide a film or a book. You can fairly talk about a game once you've reached the end. The end here is of course a false one. Since Dane published this video, you are able to progress beyond level 150. And given this isn't a review of the game, but rather a specific feature added in an update, and as such won't remain, and in fact hasn't remained, the same, this isn't comparable to reaching the end of a single player campaign. So what Uncle Dane was really putting out was a video explaining his experiences with TF2's casual matchmaking. And done properly, that's what a review is. Obviously, this is a niche video, a review focused on an aspect of a game that's a decade old that would only be seen by people already playing the game. So where Uncle Dane draws this line is likely different to where he might have in a different situation. The situation in which a review is made is also important, and would again change exactly where good falls on the bell curve, and the perceived right to discuss a game. Part 4. You. Game sucks, lol. Now I'm going to get a little personal. I'm going to talk about you. Is that okay? You sure? Thanks, I really appreciate all the trust you put in me. It means so much. Obviously, I'm not really talking about you specifically, but rather you as a collective. People with opinions on the internet. Sometimes you're a lovely bunch. Sometimes, well... What I'm getting at is why a bunch of you lot decided you were more qualified than Takahashi. Why you might get annoyed with someone else for stating their opinion, or why you might be annoyed by the person with an opinion in the first place. People with opinions on the internet have trouble expressing, and sometimes even understanding, subjectivity. I might, as an audience member, take someone else's subjective opinion and interpret it as objective truth. That would be my fault, and anyone on the internet should be able to understand that, hey, what I believe to be true isn't what someone else believes to be true, and that's okay. On the other hand, I, as a creator, should ensure that my subjectivity is always stressed. If I were to say that X game has issues for the way it portrays Y people, and a Y person saw that video, it would have been my responsibility to make it clear that I was speaking for myself, through my own interpretation, and to be careful to avoid framing the discussion as objective truth, especially if I weren't a Y person myself. Here, I want to briefly mention a form of cherry picking, or as I like to describe it for my purposes, subjectivity through omission. It is very easy to construct an argument by omitting any contradictory evidence, and it is equally easy to refute such an argument by doing the same on the other side. But it's very important to note here, those acts of omission do not make the argument untrue, although it does make it a poor one. I think you can see where this is heading. I'm going to talk about Anita Sarkeesian, someone who has regularly been accused of such omissions. To be clear, when I'm talking about Sarkeesian, I'm referring specifically to her series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games. Additionally, I'm going to reveal my biases here. Although my opinions aren't too important in this discussion, you should know that I do identify as a feminist. But that's not for me to say, as I've not always been a good ally out of ignorance in the past. I do agree with the majority of what Sarkeesian has said in these videos, but I always felt her approach was a little too dry, and her discussion was a little limited. Safe, even. Although, given the way people responded to her series, I can't really blame her for that. And I will acknowledge that raking in as many examples of any particular video game trope as possible occasionally led to some minor misrepresentations of specific games, but I don't believe those potential misrepresentations invalidated her broader points. With that out of the way, and looking primarily at the way people responded to her work, there's a massive divide between how she presents her views and how people claim she presents her views. See this video from Sean on one such distorted response to Sarkeesian. In reference to this video, regardless of Thunderfoot's views, which I obviously disagree with, the argument he constructs here is through omission of any aspect of Sarkeesian's work that would prove him wrong, and he hasn't made it obvious that his frequently misleading video is, in fact, very much subjective. There is no attempt to be balanced here, to ever concede that Sarkeesian might have a point. Now, before someone steps in to say that I'm just cherry picking here, omitting something that Thunderfoot might have said, well, yeah, I am. I won't watch all of his content for a small line in this video, but my argument here is that Thunderfoot doesn't lampshade these acts of omission, and indeed actively tries to hide them. He failed in his responsibility to acknowledge his own subjectivity, and in turn his audience failed to notice it either. To bring this back to games then, we need to look at one particular reason many people had problems with Sarkeesian in the first place. She hadn't played all of the games she used as examples. Here, context is very important. If Sarkeesian was reviewing a game or offering a comprehensive look at the game as a whole, and she hadn't played it, we can all agree that would be pretty awful. But she wasn't criticising the games. She was criticising the tropes that were in said games, which I would argue is fair to discuss without having played them. I myself haven't played 2016's Doom, but I did pass commentary on aspects of its violence and how that violence was framed in an earlier video. In this very video, I discuss Cuphead, but I haven't played it. Sarkeesian did the same, discussing elements of games she hadn't played alongside elements of games she had. I will never argue that people should be considered to have a valid view if they haven't experienced the media they discuss, but I will always argue that any opinion on any topic is valid if it can be appropriately evidenced. If I say that Doom is violent, that is self-evident. If Sarkeesian says that video games frequently lack positive representation of women, well, that's also self-evident. I and Sarkeesian obviously think that's a problem, but a lot of people with opinions on the internet disagreed, misrepresented her views, and generally embarrassed themselves because someone on the internet had a different opinion. Part 5. Conclusions. Can I go back to watching cat videos yet? Hey, if you stuck with me until this point, thanks. I know this one's pretty long and you've got stuff to do, but I really appreciate it, and I'll wrap this one up pretty quickly now. When it comes down to it, there is no definitive answer to my question. Who gets to talk about games is a big question, and there isn't a clear answer, but I have a few thoughts that I'd like to finish with. Firstly, games journalism is hard. You need to sink a massive amount of time into a game before you can really get a fair picture of it, and there will always be someone that has more experience with the game than you. I discussed Mirror's Edge a few videos back, but if you actually look at that footage of me playing, you'll quickly realise I'm actually pretty bad at it and its sequel. Hopefully I haven't misrepresented that game by missing out on some elements I couldn't interact with, but I might have, and we've got to be a little forgiving of such potential failings. Secondly, well-evidenced and comprehensive reviews are longer than is convenient. When I was writing my review of Mass Effect Andromeda, I went around searching for a fair representation of the game, one that laid out its points, evidenced them, and didn't overlook the positive for the negative or the negative for the positive. I quickly realised I wouldn't be able to make such a video because there was only one review I thought to be genuinely fair, and that review was just under half an hour long. It's not just hard to fit everything into a review of a game, it's pretty much impossible. There were many points in my Andromeda review that I couldn't fit into a video I wanted to keep under 10 minutes, and that's going to be the case for every game review out there. You can't play through every moment or see every sight a game has to offer, and then perfectly and accurately describe it in a way that will make sense for the audience. So try to forgive a critic that hasn't discussed a point you found important in your experience. Finally, don't be a jerk. Takahashi is bad at Cuphead, but he did not deserve the torrent of stupidity he received. Sarkeesian did not deserve the mountains of hate she received, and I don't deserve my lovely subscribers, but, please don't send a torrent of hatred my way to balance it out. If someone disagrees with you, it's okay. It'll happen all the time, and it's never much fun. But much worse is receiving death threats from strangers. You can, and should, respectfully disagree with someone you think is wrong, but as soon as it becomes a personal attack, you're just being a dickhead, and there's no excuse or reason for being one. So who gets to talk about games? Sort of everyone, but also no one. No one can ever tell you how you will play a game, what you'll get out of it, and to a certain extent, no one will ever be truly qualified to sum up the experience of any given game. On the other hand, you don't need to be a chef to taste burnt milk. To some extent, everyone has an idea of what works and what doesn't in a game, so even your average YouTube comment has merit. So don't ask if someone's qualified to discuss something. Instead, look at the discussion itself and add to it. People, understandingly, want to put things into boxes. Good game critic, bad game critic, and move on. But ultimately, I think it's always more complicated than that. But that's just me. I'd love to know what you think. Is there a point where you can fairly discuss a game? When does a games journalist's skill matter? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers, have a good one.